My colleague, Mr. Secretary, it's been a long morning, but I've got a couple of areas that I just need to clean up with you. One, as you know, our colleague from Oklahoma, Senator Lankford, was talking about women using dangerous chemicals for abortion. That was essentially the topic of his conversation. And I think he left most people kind of confused about what he was talking about. But I just want to ask you, and Senator Warren's been a great advocate for women in these areas as well, about what this is really all about. This topic is all about the safe, effective alternative to surgical abortion. And whether or not this medicine, which is now responsible for more than 50% of the abortions in this country, this medicine is going to be available. That's what the court case is really all about. It stems from, of course, the overturning of Roe versus Wade. We're already seeing the consequences of that ruling playing out nationwide, with women being denied the health care they need and deserve. And if, and I emphasize if, the anti-abortion activists get their way with mifepristone, which is, as I said, currently before the court, it would effectively be a nationwide abortion ban. Now, you and I served together in the other body, the House of Representatives, and quite some time, I think, before you came, I chaired the first congressional hearing on what came to be mifepristone. This was back in 1990. The issue that we focused on then is still the issue of today. And that is, are these decisions going to be made on the basis of science, or are they going to be made on the basis of politics? And I started arguing in that first hearing, I believe it was 1990, that we ought to make the decisions on the basis of science. The Food and Drug Administration was activated. It's now been available for years and years with evidence showing that it's as safe as Tylenol. And I just wanted to kind of set the record straight, because what Senator Lankford was talking about with dangerous chemicals and the like is contradicted by a lengthy set of data sets developed by the Food and Drug Administration. And I wanted to ask you a question or two on this. If access to mifepristone is rolled back, which is what may happen with this court decision, what would that do to access to health care for women all over the country in red and blue states? You know, there was all this discussion about how the states would basically be able to proceed in their own kind of fashion. Now, we have seen with respect to mifepristone, if the anti-abortion activists get their way, they could put restrictions or completely make it impossible to get access to the drug at all in every corner in the United States, to me. But I'd like to have the Secretary of Health and Human Services, since we had Senator Lankford, my colleague, talking about it, give me your assessment about what a federal ban via the courts would do to access to a safe, effective alternative to surgical abortion.
Mr. Chairman, well, first, I think it's important that when you say safe and effective, you're not just saying that because you believe it. It's because the science has shown that mifepristone for more than 2 decades has not only been safe, but it had been effective. If mifepristone were to be lost to Americans who need it as medication, it would further reduce access to care. My daughters, who today have fewer rights to access health care than their mother had, would lose even further access to the care that they need. It would also mean that more women would probably place themselves in further danger trying to access the care that they need, which would likely lead us to the scenarios that were very common pre-Roe, before 1973, where women would die, women would end up having life consequences as a result of some of the surgeries or actions that were taken, medical actions that were taken, and it puts us in a place where we have regressed. But I think, Mr. Chairman, the point that too often is missed is it's just not mifepristone. Mifepristone went through a process within the FDA to be found safe and effective. Many other drugs, many other medications that Americans rely on went through essentially the same process of analysis. If the analysis that was done with mifepristone were to be overturned, it'd be very difficult for anyone to conceive that the only result is that mifepristone is taken off of the market and access to consumers, because there's so many other drugs that went through the same process that would then be subject perhaps to the same legal challenges on their accessibility throughout America for Americans.
It's an important point to make, and it is exactly the point that we made more than 30 years ago. I remember in a drafty House Small Business hearing room where I was chairing this hearing, we said the second you decide to start making these decisions on the basis of politics rather than science, and we're talking about how the FDA spent literally decades working through the scientific issues with respect to the safety of mifepristone, you're going back to the Wild West. I mean, you're going back to the days when basically politics and who's got political strength is going to drive decisions that I think the American people, by an overwhelming majority, want to have made through scientists and other policymakers who aren't about D's and R's, but they're about good science. And I appreciate your bringing this up. And I'm continually struck by how the issues we had to wrestle with more than 30 years ago, putting science above politics, are exactly what the challenge is now with respect to mifepristone. Let me ask you about the Office of Refugee Resettlement, where we heard lots of back and forth and charges leveled against you. And, you know, this is an office that works with unaccompanied children. That's their, responsibility. And for years, years and years, these were the kids put in cages. And the Trump administration, as far as I can tell, even lost track of them, lost track of where they were. And my understanding is the Office of Refugee Resettlement, under several statutes, is now working to improve the safeguards for these kids. And as we wrap up, that seems to be a mission that ought to get the support of Democrats and Republicans. Your thoughts?
It actually should. And as I try to explain, when Congress passed the laws that placed children who did not have an adult with them that came from the border, that our responsibility under the statutes that Congress passed were to provide the temporary care of these children until they were placed with a vetted sponsor. Once we place that child with a vetted sponsor, our authorities over that child end. That child doesn't need to communicate with us. The sponsor doesn't need to communicate with us. And so we do everything we can, including after we discharge the child, to try to follow up. Even though there's no requirement that the child or the sponsor get back to us, we do try to do follow-up to make sure that everything is moving the right way with that sponsorship. And what we're doing is working with the Department of Labor, because they are the ones that track any labor violations that might occur, especially with child labor. And we're trying to work with them to make sure that we let them know what we know about any kids in the event that some of these children that might be trafficked or used for exploitive child labor are among those that were at one point under our custody. But we are trying to do everything we can with the authorities and the resources Congress gives us to provide the care that you would expect for any child to receive. We don't deal with the immigration circumstance of the child. That is done by the Department of Homeland Security. We deal with the care under law, as we're required, to make sure that the children are receiving the care that any child in this country should receive.
So I guess about 3 hours ago, what I did is tried to take the exact quotes from former President Trump, who claimed that he was going to do so much to lower medicine, and he was going to take on big pharma, and he was going to be for more competition. And then I compared it to the record, which showed none of that. And I contrasted it with President Biden and President Biden's conversation with me, and I'm sure plenty of other people, shortly after the 2020 election. And we talked about getting rid of Big Pharma's holy grail, where they could just stop any negotiations. We talked about price gouging, and we talked about out-of-pocket, caps. And I remember walking off the floor of the United States Senate in 2022, late in the summer, and I said, we actually did it. This is not a debatable proposition. We passed this law. The President of the United States is going to sign it. And I just think it's important as we wrap up to make clear that there are differences as deep as Crater Lake, as I said 3 hours ago. And what the differences are is about values. And the previous administration was sympathetic to the corporate, interests. And those corporate interests were driving up healthcare costs, particularly Big Pharma. And what President Biden said, and what I support, is our North Star is getting a fair shake for people without power and without clout. And all those seniors, we now have been able, your people got it to us, 9 million Americans, 1 out of every 7 seniors are going to benefit in Medicare from the fact that we're negotiating, working to get a fair shake. So you took a lot of hits this morning. I guess that goes with the turf. But I want you to know, I think that what you're doing and the values that support these actions are what the American people want. I look forward to working with you closely in the days ahead. And for senators, questions for the record are due next Thursday, the 21st at 5 p.m. Ms. Secretary, I look forward to talking to you soon. With that, the Finance Committee is adjourned.